Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Neives Wash Process Peru from Say Coffee. And there's the box right there. And Say, based out of Brooklyn, New York, and they're a roaster that features pretty regularly on this channel, and that's not too surprising given that our Say reviews are quite popular with you guys. But in addition to that, they're always a nice break from those more wild, out there experimental coffees that we review quite frequently on this channel, given that Say almost exclusively offers wash processed coffees. But in addition to that, Say is always a fun coffee roaster to review, given that their coffee is either amazing or it's one that kind of leaves you scratching your head, and they're few and far in between. So it's always interesting to see what you get from one of their coffees, given that they all sound like my flavor profile sort of coffees. So looking forward to discussing yet another one of Say's coffees, as today is day 26 of this coffee. And recipe I settled on for this one was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the earlier days, I liked it better through the Chemex, but I think by the last couple of cups, I liked it a little bit more through the V60, which would indicate a more medium fine grind. Say is an American Light for the roast profile. With those things out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 12, first impression, and yeah, I started before the day 14 mark, but it actually was a quite positive start. It was definitely chocolate forward, but plenty of sweetness to accompany a more robust chocolate in general. And I don't mind chocolate, especially if it's on the more sweet side of things. Given that there was a heavy chocolate flavor note right from the start, it was a little bit of a concerning factor earlier on when purchasing and trying out this coffee. But as long as it kind of maybe has a little bit more of a unique aspect to it, then I can see it in a more positive light. That was the case with this coffee, as it reminded me quite a bit of a brownie, actually, a sweeter brownie. So in that sense, it was a positive first impression. Slight bit of some vintage Say citrus, but that's not too surprising, especially since I started it even earlier than normal. So positive first impression, we continue. Day 14, an even better second impression, not too surprising, combination of a little bit more rest in addition to it being through the Chemex really did seem to improve this coffee, as it had a bit more of a dark sweetness to it and a slight bit more of the fruit aspect. They have a strawberry flavor note listed on here, and I will never say that at any point I found this to be a very strong or abundant characteristic in this cup of coffee, as if anything it was maybe a little bit more faint and in the background if you were even able to experience it. But as a result, it was still quite nice, as the cup remained pretty chocolate forward, yet again reminiscent of what I would describe as a brownie. Day 16, back through the Chemex with higher temperatures, and it's pretty good yet again. It had a little bit more of those classic South American characteristics to it as well, including a slight bit of nuttiness. So this time it kind of reminded me of a peanut butter chocolate brownie, which is kind of a little nice thing and kind of a little unique in that sense as well. Slightly weak berry, so again, I never really got too much of a strong berry aspect to this cup of coffee, which I mean, I don't think I was ever necessarily expecting from it. Would have been a nice little addition to it, but it was already a pretty nice cup of coffee. Day 16 through the V60 with higher temperatures and solid yet again, so I was seeing improvement from this cup of coffee in general, and I think a lot of that had to do with the rest, as I oftentimes say that the best thing you can do for Say's coffees is maybe just give it a little bit more rest, and then you will see significant improvement in their coffee in general. A bit more of a brown candied sweetness to it, and they have a caramel flavor note listed on here, and that's honestly what I was looking for the most in this cup of coffee. It definitely was a secondary characteristic to what felt like a very strong brownie aspect to this cup of coffee. So positive yet again, but was still kind of looking for maybe a little bit more of a way to get out that sugary sweetness. Day 22, coffee continues to improve. So I've continued to see improvement in this coffee in general, as it's a slight bit more sweet, a slight bit more nuttiness, and still plenty of that chocolate base that's coming from this cup of coffee. Almost brownie-like sweetness yet again. Fruit components definitely more soft and in the background, but it does have a nice bit of depth to this cup of coffee, as that additional characteristic, even if not the most pronounced aspect to it, is a nice little added characteristic and benefit to this coffee. Day 24, final note I have, one more day back through the Chemex, and I think that's kind of when I made my decision that this coffee was just maybe a little bit more enjoyable through the V60 for me. That's not too surprising. Typically with South American coffees, I enjoy them a little bit more. For that reason, they kind of do accentuate those South American characteristics to them. Cup has a slight bit more of that lighter chocolate base, and that's something I really wanted to say was with more light profiled cups of coffee in general, the chocolate is very different than maybe a little bit more of a developed cup of coffee, as it's a little bit more kind of like a lighter based chocolate, if that makes a lot of sense. So maybe your more high-end craft chocolate bars as opposed to a more like rich, sweet milk chocolate that I get from maybe some more developed coffees in general, if that makes a lot of sense. Mixed semi-sweet dark chocolate brownie with a bit of nuttiness to it. Overall, by the end, it was pretty nice. I just noticed that the Chemex made the components a little bit darker for whatever reason, and that's kind of the major distinguishing factor between those two brew methods. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. A bunch of level 4s, so let's run through those real quick. Sweetness level 4. That's the best aspect of this cup of coffee, is it may be super chocolate forward, but given that it was quite a sweet chocolate, then I don't mind it being super chocolate in that sense. Finish, level 4. Yeah, I mean, typically chocolate tends to leave a very lasting finish in coffee in general, so that's not too surprising right there. Cleanliness, level 4. Yeah, it's a super clean cup of coffee. I mean, it is a wash process coffee. It is from Say. That's not surprising in any sense. The body's probably the one that's going to be the most surprising for this tasting wheel, because that's really, really high. This tasting wheel was made with a Chemex. This coffee has a lot of body to it. I can only imagine what it would have been if you would have brewed it through something like a French press, AeroPress, automatic coffee maker, because this has a really nice velvety body to it. Chocolate, level 4. Yeah, that's definitely there. I've been kind of harping on that the entire video, as that is by far the most pronounced characteristic to it. And then we'll go to the level 3s real quick. The caramel. Now, here's what I've noticed, especially letting this coffee cool down, is that the caramel really does pop a little bit more with a little bit more of a cool down, as I would actually chart this at a level 4 right now after this coffee has kind of reached room temperature. So that definitely does increase. Saltiness, level 3, that's kind of to focus on the nuttiness that was coming from this cup of coffee. There were times the nuttiness was quite well pronounced and quite enjoyable too. Again, reminded me a lot of peanut butter, so that's a really positive thing for me. And citrus, yeah, kind of touched on that. Typically, I will always chart some citrus in almost every single one of Say's coffees, as they oftentimes do come out a little citric. Berry fruit, ever so slight. And they have a strawberry flavor note listed on here. I think I've said that already. And yeah, it's not overly pronounced in any sense, but it's there. It's faint, it's slight, it's in the background. And the acidity at a level 3 is probably a nice little selling point for me, as at the higher temperatures, obviously, we're experiencing a lot more of that acidity, and that's why I liked it maybe a little toned down at that 205 as opposed to 208 or higher, because that would have justified and warranted, yet again, that level 4. But kind of having the sweetness over the acidity is always going to be a nice selling point to me, and I don't think there's too much else worth noting. The bitterness does come from what feels like a little bit more of a dark chocolate aspect to it. But for the most part, I quite like the way that this tasting wheel looks. Maybe some slight changes with the difference in temperature of the coffee in general, but for the most part, pretty in line with what I was experiencing. All right, my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I've actually had some positive experiences with Peruvian coffees this year, so I think Peru is having a pretty good year. I think this was one of Say's better coffees, as I kind of alluded to earlier in the start of this video. It's either a pretty good cup of coffee or it's one that kind of leaves you scratching your head. And I feel like I was experiencing this coffee continue to improve, and I feel like this is probably the peak, as I feel like it's maybe starting to slightly taper off a little bit. So it kind of leaves that lasting impression by the end that you had a really good experience with this cup of coffee, and it's not quite dropping off to an extent that sometimes Say's coffees can. So for all of those reasons, the fact that it's also sweeter, more sweet than acidic, it's a really nice cup of coffee for me. It's not going to win any awards for being one of my favorite coffees of the year, but especially for it being, well, a standard wash process Peru, I thought it was quite nice. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. Obviously, you have to keep in mind Say's lighter profile in general. If you really like brownies, I think this is a good fit for you. Slight bit of nuttiness and just that kind of brown sweetness in general, that brown candied sweetness, that maybe slightly more nutty sweetness. It was there in abundance. Sweeter cup of coffee in general, so all of those things were quite positive for me. Definitely a very South American coffee by the end, even for a coffee roaster that does roast as light as Say does. I think I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this Peru, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Maria Neives Wash Process Peru from Say Coffee. Thank you for watching.